Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World, the podcast that celebrates the remarkable women of the Viking Age. From fierce warriors and powerful queens to wise seers and cunning goddesses, these women left an indelible mark on history. Join authors Johanna and K.S. each month as we explore the stories, achievements, and impact of Norse women. Welcome to Shield Maidens, Women of the Norse World. This is episode 8, in which Johanna and I discuss healers and midwives in the Viking Age. I'm K.S. Barton. I'm the author of the Norse Family Trilogy, a story in which a young Viking woman, the daughter of a jarl, and a Viking warrior are caught in a deadly blood feud between two families. It's a story of family, love, sacrifice, and betrayal. And with me is Johanna Wittenberg. Hi, Johanna.
Hi, how are you doing, Kim?
I'm great.
I'm Johanna Wittenberg, author of the Norse Women series, which is based on the life of a Norse queen who ruled alone for 18 years at the dawn of the Viking Age. Okay, well, this is going to be a good one.
Yes. So in this episode, we'll be discussing healers. Well, there were heroes too. Healers and midwives. So we were discussing beforehand that we had to dig to find some of these references because the poets and the men who later wrote down all these sagas and poems did not seem to be all that interested in the topic or in these women.
As usual.
But one thing seems to be certain is that these female healers and midwives, they use chants, songs, runes, as well as your typical poultices and salves and brews to drink. And we've talked about magical women in previous episodes, and there seems to be a connection between the magic of those women who were the Volar and these healing women.
Yes.
Especially with the songs that they would sing for healing. All right, are we ready to get into it?
I think so.
Okay. So our first example comes from the history of Saint Olaf, which is in the Heimskringla. And in this, there is a story of a warrior who was in King Olaf's retinue, and this man was injured in battle. Things were not going well in this battle at all. King Olaf was killed along with many of his men. So Tormod was among these warriors, and he was struck by an arrow on the left side of his body near his heart. So he staggers off the battlefield, and he finds a hut with other wounded warriors where there were women binding their wounds. It almost reminded me of you remember the old show MASH?
Yes. I bet it was like that.
In a tent, where there were some medical people who could, triage them and then take care of them. So in this room, there was a good fire, and the healer women were heating water to wash the wounds of the wounded. So Tormod enters, and he calls out to one of them about his injury. He takes off his clothes and he sits down. So she comes over to him, and in a stone kettle, it made it specific that it was a stone kettle, she cooked leeks and other grasses. So the story didn't specify what those other grasses were. I imagine they were probably something kind of bitter, or maybe I don't know, maybe like green onions or something. I think because she wanted to smell it, that she would want something that was odorous.
Yes. And also the stone kettle would have been soapstone, because that has been, rather than using metal or iron kettles, they often use soapstone kettles.
That's right. So once she fixed up this broth, she offered it to Tormod to drink it, because she wanted to, once he drank it, she could smell like if the leeks, L-E-E-K-S, were like,
the leeks were leaking.
If something was leaking, she'd be able to smell it, she would know the wound was deep, or maybe it perforated something.
Right. That was how they knew if it had perforated a vital organ.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, I've noticed that quite a bit in my research, that healers would use their sense of smell to determine if something
often.
Yeah, it's really kind of neat. I wonder if I don't really see that as much in modern medicine. Anyway.
That's because it's an old wives' tale. Because women did it.
That's right. Tormod refuses to drink this broth, either because he knew he was going to die, or maybe because it smelled horrible, because a lot of these healing herbs were bitter and it might have just smelled terrible. So instead, the healer takes some tongs and she heats them over the fire and she uses them to try to remove the arrowhead that was still embedded in his body. It doesn't work. The wound had swollen around the arrowhead, but this little bit at least shows us that she knew enough to sterilize the tongs, and that the women were heating the water to clean the wounds. So at least she knew to put the tongs in the fire. So then he tells her to just cut the skin away to expose the arrowhead. And then he offers her a gold arm ring that he had been given that morning by King Olaf, and tells her basically she can do whatever she wants with it. Basically, I guess it's his payment to her. He probably still realizes he's going to die. So,
yeah.
But before she can do anything, Tormod takes the tongs from her and he pulls out the arrowhead.
Oh, that hurt. They had to be tough, boy.
Oh my gosh. And it had barbs on it. So in the actual story, it said that when it came out, it was dripping with pieces of his heart.
Oh my God.
So yeah. Can you just imagine this guy sitting there holding these tongs with, anyway, it's pretty horrifying. He did die. Right after that, right after that, he died. So, yeah. But one of the things I like about this little vignette, and it's a really short little part of this longer saga, at least because it shows us, at least in this case, that these healing women were near the battlefield and they were there to treat the wounded. So that made me wonder, who were these women? Were they wives of the warriors? Were they specifically brought there to be nurses and they traveled with the army? Were they local women who they had come over to help? So it didn't say. Do you know if...
No, I've never found it anywhere, but I do know that, the Norse term for doctor or healer is leknir, and they are often women. And I will tell you after a little bit later, there's a lot of women healers mentioned in the sagas, but they also mention male healers, especially on the battlefield where there may not have been any women. There's some really gruesome stories about this. But in the Heimskringla, the sagas of Magnus Goda speaks of a lack of doctors, female doctors, on the battlefield. And the king assigned warriors with the softest hands to bind the wounds, although none of them had ever tried it before. That's what this saga mentions is, and it's some very rough healing. It's like what you just described, where they're drawing arrowheads or spears out of the men, and the wounds didn't always heal properly, and sometimes people were left crippled for life from it if they even survived. But there's no specific mention. That it's just that it usually is women that are mentioned as healers.
And it actually reminded me too, I studied the U.S. Civil War a lot when I was in college, and it kind of made me think of that too, with the way the tents were set up, and these men would just have to go there, and it would just be really horrific.
Oh yeah,
cutting body parts off, blood everywhere, infections just running rampant. It couldn't have been any better in the Viking age.
Oh, I'm sure it was worse. And the people who were trying to heal, they were exhausted because they were usually overrun after a battle.
So, and there was also Viga Glum's saga. There was a man named Thorin who was injured in a fight, and his shoulder was cut in a way that his lungs were exposed. Now, how that wasn't fatal, I don't know. So there was a woman named Haldora who bound his wounds and watched over him until the fight was over. And then he was laid up with his wounds for the whole summer. I mean, I can't believe he just took one summer to recover from that.
And how he avoided infection? You kind of explained that, because they boiled water and they heated their instruments. So they did know a lot about infection.
Yeah, there was probably some kind of poultices that she could put on. Maybe she had to stitch him up.
I'm sure. And that may be one of the reasons that women were usually healers, because women were skilled with needlework.
Ah, good point.
Yep.
Good point. I wonder what their thread would have been.
Well, I know sometimes they used gut,
Mhm.
like cat gut or
Cat
whatever.
gut. Yeah.
That was one of the things, because that's more organic. I don't know.
And I can't remember if Haldor was she his wife or was she just a
I
because he
think she was just a woman who.
yeah.
There was another story where the wife, which we'll get to in a while, but I thought this was just one of the healers on the battlefield.
Yeah. So she must have really, maybe she bound it up really tight to like hold. But I'm
Hold
surprised,
his
like,
lungs in.
oh my gosh. Yeah. Those women. Yeah.
Unimaginable.
Yeah. It's awful to think about.
Yes.
So in a previous episode, we mentioned the adventures of the Viking Svipdag and how he was tasked by his evil stepmother to go on a journey to find the woman Mengeloth because she was the only woman he could marry. So in that episode, we talked about Svipdag's mother, the Volva Groa, and how she chanted protective spells over him. But later in the poem, once Svipdag reaches Mengeloth's castle, and it's guarded by a Jotun named Fjolsvith, they talk for a while, and the Jotun tells Svipdag about the tree that can't be felled by fire or iron. Well, there's another interesting little tidbit about this tree, is that its fruit is taken and laid upon a fire for women in labor.
Ah.
Once this is done, the baby will come, and somehow this meets out the fate among men. Like somehow this helps to determine their fate.
Oh, that's interesting.
But it's not clear what the fruit is or how that actually works.
No, but there's a lot of things in the sagas that are like that. They're very obscure. You're supposed to know.
Yeah, it's just magical fruit that can magically help with your fate, determine your fate.
There you go.
And a few stanzas later in the same poem, Fjolsvith mentions that Mengeloth has 9 women who attend her and that they sit on Lifaberg, which means the hill of healing. And one of the women is named Er. So some of our listeners might have heard of Er as the Norse goddess of healing. She's mentioned 3 times, at least that I could find. One of them being her as one of the women who sit on the hill of healing with Mengeloth. Another is where I suspect her name as the goddess of healing comes from. In the Prose Edda in Gylfaginning, Er is listed with some other goddesses, and she's 3rd. She's behind Frigg and before Freya.
Oh.
And she's called the best doctor or the best physician or whatever. Then that's all it says. She's just listed with Frigg and Freya, and she's the best doctor. So I think that's probably where, we all get the idea that she's the goddess of healing, but that's really the only mention, that in the hill of healing. So, and then the 3rd time is in, okay. Skarpamal.
Good job.
Only this time she's in a list of Valkyries. Now, whether this is the same heir or another deity of the same name is not clear. She's just mentioned, it's just like, how they are in the saga. Sometimes they just list off, here's the names of so-and-so. And she's just in that list. It doesn't give anything else about her. So there's no mention of healing there either.
And that's like Skuld, one of the Norns. She's also listed as a Valkyrie. And so whether it's the same Skuld or not, we don't know for sure.
Yeah. And she's just one of those goddesses that we only have these like little tiny tantalizing bits of information about her.
And that's true of many of the female goddesses. Yeah.
And, so I, as a writer, I like to imagine that she had a much bigger role in the roles in the lives of women, and especially healers, like other goddesses who got left out of the stories and poems because they were told by male court poets and then written down by male priests and monks. So because I still just believe that these women were telling their own stories about their own goddesses, and maybe it was sometimes even completely separate from what the men were doing. So the men who were telling these poems just didn't even know like the richness of it.
Well, I think too, though, that there was a period of time in early Christianity where women's magic and women's power was actively suppressed by the church.
Yeah.
And I think personally that many of these stories were just left out. They weren't written down. They weren't recorded. They were just suppressed by the church. And that's why we don't have them, because they were never written down.
Yeah.
That's true. Like with Queen Osa, who's my main character, there's just a bare paragraph about her. But she reigned for 18 years.
Right.
So she must have done a few things in her time, but none of those stories were ever written down.
She had an impact.
Yeah, she did. So I'm right.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of it's a short story I wrote about, kind of like a prequel story. And one of my main characters it was kind of about how she and her husband met, and she was a healer and she was brought in to heal him. And I did have her, when she first enters the tent, before she touches him or does anything, I have her sing a song to air before she even works on her. Yeah.
So we can remember her.
We can do that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, in Njal's saga, there is a woman whose name is Hildegun the Healer. And she treats the wounds of her husband and her father after they've gotten into a fight. And she also gives them a really hard time for starting the fight.
I could just see her like some mother going, "What were you thinking?"
Exactly. Well,
I'm going to clean up this mess.
There's another saga, and I can't even remember which one it is, where two men are starting to fight and the women throw clothes over them so they can't fight.
Oh, that's funny.
Managed to stop the fight. I can't remember exactly which saga it was, but it just tickled me. In fact, I used that in one of my books.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
I mean, I can just see these women I have some of the women in my story, we're the ones who have to pick up the pieces.
Exactly. And sew up the pieces.
Yeah. Like literally sew up the pieces when you do this thing. So, you're going, oh yeah, I hope I die bravely or blah, 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 fighting. And they're just like, okay.
That's right.
And we've got to clean it up.
Yes. Well, there's another saga, which I will not pronounce because I can't. But in it, a healer named Groa, which is a common name for a vulva. And so that's another hint that maybe there's a connection between healers and the vulvas. She watches over the bodies of those killed in battle. And she believes that her nephew Grim was still alive. And she goes and calls in a leknir or doctor named Alfgerd. And when the dead are laid in the ground, Alfgerd takes Grim away secretly. She spirits him away and heals him, so that his enemies don't know that he's alive. So he recovered in secret and ultimately avenged his brother. Anyway, so here we have a healer who's watching over the bodies, and a leknir or doctor named Alfgerd, and that's a woman's name as well. So we've got two women that are involved in the healing.
I like that Alfgerd's name has Alf in it, and then she spirits him away. There's some magic going on there too.
Some magic, probably. So later in this same story, Grim is treated for another wound it's in his foot and it's gone septic. And he's treated by another woman named Gefjun, who she claims to be a doctor. She binds the foot and she leaves him alone. And then he dies. He dies from the septic wound. Now, later in this saga, Gefjun is revealed to be skilled in magic. And she's also the mistress of a man that Grim had killed. So it's not actually mentioned, but it's implied that maybe her cure was actually the cause of his death, or that she purposely let him die. Of course, on the other hand, when someone's wound goes septic, especially in the Viking age, they didn't have antibiotics. So it might have been a done deal when she even saw him. But all those things are not mentioned, as so many things are not mentioned in the sagas. It's just left to us to infer.
I mean, even now, a septic wound can kill someone.
Yeah.
Even with modern medicine, it's pretty dangerous.
It's pretty dangerous. Yes. So,
this story is interesting to me because we have Groa, Alfgerd, and Gefjun is a name that sometimes mentioned with Freya,
Yes.
as like, so that's kind of interesting that these healing women have those particular names. Like,
Yes. Now they did name people after some of the goddesses, although it was more
right.
likely to name them after the Dis, human dead, which would be that they were maybe being named after an ancestress or something. But they did, and they didn't have a lot of names, as you find if you're trying to find names for your characters.
Yes.
There weren't that many names. They use the same name over and over, like Thor.
Yeah. And Grim isn't Grim another name for Odin?
Yes. Hmm? Yes. Grimnir.
Yeah.
And the word grim means mask.
Mm-hmm.
So
okay, I'm going to look deeper into this story. So now it's piqued my interest.
And I wrote down it's Droplagersona saga. I just cannot pronounce it, nor do I know what it means. But I did run across that interesting story in there. So another thing is the Norse law, which we have laws that are pretty early on. They were written down in the 11th century. So that's the very late Viking Age, or the shortly after Scandinavia became Christianized. So Norse law designated compensation for various types of wounds, and that included the cost of the doctor's fee to treat it. In Norway, the Frostating law gets very specific about the fines for certain types of injuries, like if you cut off a man's nose or his hand, and they actually say, how many auras or, coins this is worth. There is a section dedicated to bone money, and it mentions some of the medical treatments. If it becomes necessary to burn or cauterize, I assume, a man's wound, 1 aura shall be due as compensation for the pain every time it needs to be burned. An aura shall be due every month as leech money, or, this is for the doctor. And it shall be necessary, if it shall be necessary to turn the man on his face, there shall be a fine for evil intent. I don't know quite what that means. I don't think I want to.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's specifically mentioned. It's not explained, but I guess they knew what it meant. So leech money is mentioned in several places in this law.
That's interesting. That they call it bone money.
Bone money. Yeah.
I love that. It's so interesting that, they had these fines and fees for, things like that. Well, here's how much it's worth for your hand. But they did that even with people's lives.
Yes.
If you killed, somebody, and this person was worth this much, and this person was worth this much, women weren't worth as much as men, blah, blah, blah. So they really had this was Norway, huh? Okay.
Yeah. And even an unborn child was worth a certain amount of money.
Oh, okay.
So, yes. So like a pregnant woman was worth double.
Okay. That makes sense. It's just a very pragmatic way of looking at the world. Like, it was a violent time where people were dying from all kinds of things. So I could see just being really practical, like, okay, I bet a right hand was probably worth more than a left hand.
Oh, yeah. If the man was right-handed.
If the man was right-handed.
Another part of there's in Njal's saga, I believe it is, there's a story where a slave is murdered at the instigation of this man's wife. And he actually meets with the owner of the slave and pays him the money, the worth of the slave, to keep from getting into a feud. But in reality, their wives are fighting and trying to get them into a feud. And so this escalates. It keeps escalating until they finally have to, but they try to settle it by paying the money and, agreeing not to get into a feud.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Well, that's what they would do with the thing as well, is they would often, people would bring their grievances, and then they would, okay, well, you pay this much, so-and-so killed 2 of my cows, so you pay this much for him, or this man killed this. Yeah. And it
was specifically set out in these laws, how much everybody was worth, each type of person was worth.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of awful and like, well, okay. I guess it's better than just because they were constantly killing each other. So what's better to just keep a feud going and going and going, or to just finally put it to rest by some monetary compensation?
Yeah. That's why it was introduced, is it was a way to stop the feuding, from escalating to the point where it was completely out of hand, and it kept going for generations sometimes. Right.
Well, speaking of generations, we're going to talk a little bit about childbirth and midwives. So childbirth was a really dangerous event for a woman. And I think I even say on my website that I think women who went into the birthing chamber were just as brave as men who went into the shield wall, because your chances of dying were probably equally as grim.
Yes.
So, I mean, even though nobody knows for sure, of course, the mortality rate for women giving birth was pretty high in the Viking age. There was a high infant mortality rate. I've seen some numbers, but I've never seen, I don't know where the numbers come from, so I don't want to give them out, but it's pretty high, like how many children die before they're even 5 years old.
Yes.
Miscarriage was also a serious risk for women. I mean, even now, even in the 21st century, 10 to 20% of pregnancies end in a miscarriage.
Wow.
So if that's happening now, it must have been a lot higher then, because they didn't have the nutrition necessarily. Yes. If somebody was maybe pregnant during the really lean months of, like January through like April or May, it might have been really tricky for them. They had to work, all through their pregnancies. So maybe even if they were having a tricky one, they probably would have still had to work. So I imagine it would have been even higher back in that time period. Yeah, I was really shocked when I saw that percentage for today. Yeah,
I had no idea.
At least they had midwives.
Yes. Well, I think that's because women knew they had to look out for each other.
Exactly.
So the midwives were called Bjargrigur. I cannot pronounce that. We need to get a Norse-speaking person in here. But anyway, they were helping women. Okay, that's what they were called. They had a title, and they were present at the birth. And only women were allowed in the birthing chamber. This is more of women's magic that men were excluded from. And the women went through labor and delivery apparently on their hands and knees, supported by other women. And the child was received from behind. And runes and chants were part of the birthing process. There's a tale called Odrun's tale. And Odrun, the midwife, loosened saddles and other knots in the house to help ease the childbirth. She went to the woman in labor and sang Galdr songs, beseeching Frigg and Freya and more of the gods. So that could be air, there could be other goddesses that would help. There's a lot of evidence that these Galdr songs were a very important part of the birthing process.
And with the knots and the tying up, there's also a Greek mythology tale about that. So, the hero Hercules.
Yes.
From Greek mythology, his mother, he was a twin. And I guess when his mother was in labor, Hera, Zeus's wife, because Zeus had an affair with this woman, Hercules' mother, Hera, of course, was going after her. So she got the goddess of childbirth to go sit outside of Hercules' mother's birthing chamber, cross her legs, and tie her clothes in knots so that the labor couldn't give birth.
Oh my goodness.
So ultimately she was tricked. She was shown like a baby and said, oh yeah, she had the baby. So the goddess of childbirth uncrossed her legs and unknotted her clothes, and Hercules' mother was able to have the child. So
my goodness, I didn't even know that one. That is fascinating.
Yeah.
The similarities.
Yeah. And I can't remember exactly. I think maybe she was also chanting something.
I wouldn't be
to
surprised.
keep that from happening. But I'm not sure.
Well, there's another story about Odrin, and she goes to a woman named Borgny, who's in labor, and she's in bitter pain. And the narrator asks Odrin if she could help Borgny. Borgny sits at the knees of Odrin, who sings Galder songs, which are magical and powerful. And Borgny gives birth to twins, a boy and a girl. And even though she's weak, she says that Frigg and Freya have saved her from sorrow. Now, there's another one in the Sigdrifumal, and maybe you want to tell us about that.
Oh, sure. In this one, she's sometimes called Sigdrifa, but she's also maybe Brunhilde.
Yep.
So Brunhilde.
Right.
So I think she's the same person.
It is.
So Sigurd, the dragon slayer, who we've mentioned in other podcasts, he goes to her. And this is similar, I think, to the way Odin or Freya or Svipdag went to the Volva and asked them questions and got these magical women to give them information. So Sigurd goes to Brunhild and asks her about the Limrunar, the life runes, to heal wounds and sickness. So these are she there's several stanzas where she tells him about the magic of the runes.
The healing runes.
The healing. And in one of the stanzas, Brunhild or Sigrifa tells Sigurd about healing runes. She says to use branch runes if you want to be a healer and cure wounds. She says to cut runes into the bark and wood of a tree whose branches bend to the east. It's very specific. They have to bend towards the east. I don't know why that is. There's no explanation. Do you have any theories about why it would be east?
I know I don't, but I know that I think it's Tacitus talks about fruiting wood, that they carve the runes into fruiting wood.
Okay.
So, they had specific things that were required for the runes to work.
It was very specific sometimes, even though it's sometimes hard to understand.
Yes, very. And I think, when you have an outside historian recording these things, they may not always understand what they're doing, but he does describe them pretty in depth.
So there's another stanza in that poem that for runes for childbirth, she says that you must know birth runes if you want to release a child from its mother. So this is pretty specific. You must know these runes. So that says that these midwives must have known runic magic. So she says the midwife or helping woman must write them or cut them. I wasn't clear whether if there's some kind of like a die she writes on her hand, or if she actually has to carve the runes into her hand, her palms.
I know. I read that too. And, it could be just tracing it with the blade of a knife, the tip of a knife. I don't know, because I can't imagine cutting them, but,
unless they had them permanently cut there. I don't know.
It's very strange, but I can't quite imagine it.
Yeah, in the palms and like around the joints or clasped on the joints. That was kind of strange too. I was having a hard time imagining what that actually looked like to have runes clasped or around your joints, unless they worked up and around your fingers or something. Yeah. Anyway, so that's just another example that these women knew runic magic. Well, and Sigurd is the grandson, I think, of Volsung.
Yes.
So his grandfather in the Volsung saga, there's a story of his birth. So in this particular saga, there was a king named Rerir, and I don't know if I'm saying that's right. There's a lot of R's. It's Rerir. Rerir. And he had an unnamed wife, poor woman. She was unnamed. And they were together for a long, long time, but she never became pregnant. They prayed to the gods. Odin and Freya heard their prayers. So Freya sent Ljód, the daughter of a Jotun named Hrimnir, to give Reyr and his wife an apple. Ljód wore a crow's cape. The translation said she did on her the gear of a crow. So I'm picturing a cape with feathers anyway. Feathers or something. And she dropped the apple into King Ur's lap. He took it home and his wife ate some of it. That seems very fairy tale-ish to me.
Yes.
So this wife,
that's where fairy tales came from.
Right. So this wife, she grows huge with child and she stays that way for a long time. And of course, this is the Viking age. The king can't sit around forever waiting for his wife to give birth. So he goes out warring. And during his journey, he grows sick and he dies. And his poor, unfortunate wife stays pregnant for 6 years.
This sounds like many women's nightmare, They'll never stop being pregnant.
I have had one child, and believe me, if it went on for 6 years, it wouldn't get that far. So she finally figures that she's not going to live much longer, and she orders the baby to be cut out of her. They do this. I don't know who, it's not said, if it's midwives or a doctor, it's not specific. And a fully grown man-child comes out of her. So I guess after you've gestated for 6 years, you're pretty big.
Pretty big baby. Well, but what's interesting is that basically they're talking about a cesarean section.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's something they apparently practiced during the Viking Age.
Yeah.
And earlier, because this is earlier than Viking Age, this saga.
Right. The Volsung saga. Yeah.
It's
correct. Yeah.
Earlier.
So this newly born man-child kisses his mother before she dies.
Oh.
And all I could think was this poor woman staying alive through that grisly childbirth.
Oh.
So he's named Volsung, and he becomes like a really famous warrior. And in an interesting little circle back in the story, the Jotun Hrimnir gives his daughter Ljod to Volsung as his wife. So she's the one who had delivered the apple that was the catalyst for this woman becoming pregnant. That's all I could think about was being pregnant for 6 years and then having to have this baby cut out. It's just,
it's like torture.
Exactly. And then there's another saga, Gangu Hrolf's saga, where midway into this story, Hrolf is with a group of king's men who are hunting for a stag. So in Celtic mythology, white stags are often a symbol of magic.
Oh.
Especially if it often leads men into forests or clearings in forests. Sometimes it's considered like a messenger from the gods or from the afterlife or something. And even in King Arthur, there's a story of a white stag. And in the King Arthur stories, that stag can never be caught because that stag is magical. Yes. But in Hrolf's saga, so these hunters are unsuccessful. But one guy says he's going to stay and capture it. Hrolf joins him. They set off to catch the stag. And the other guy, for no reason that's specified, just stops and doesn't want to go on. I assume there's because he was afraid of some magic. Probably. Or maybe elves or something like that, because Hrolf comes to a clearing with a house. So if a white stag leads you to a clearing in the forest with a house, and a woman comes out of that house, there's probably some magic afoot.
Yeah.
She asks him to lay his hands on her daughter, who is in labor, and she can't give birth unless she's touched by a human. So
the mother's not a human then.
Or their daughter's not a human. I don't know. Maybe they're elves. So he does it for her, and she gives him the stag, and she also gives him a gold ring, which comes in handy later for him. But the one thing I noticed about both of these stories, about the story of Volsung and Gangu Hrolf, is that the focus is on the men in the story, not the mothers. So these mothers are just basically a means to an end. There's no mention of how awful it would have been for Volsung's mother to carry him for 6 years or have a C-section. It romanticizes how, he gave her a kiss after he's delivered, not even acknowledging the excruciating pain she would have been in. In Gangu Hrolf's saga, there's no mention of the young woman who is struggling with her labor. It's about Hrolf and how he needs to do this to go on his adventures. So yeah, I read these and I'm like, this is what made me want to start writing about women in the Viking Age, is because I would read these little tidbits and I'm like, but what about her? But how did she feel?
Well, and there is one story in one of the sagas, and I can't remember which one. It might be the Laxdela saga, but these people are traveling, and this woman comes, they come to a river, and this woman says, well, I need to stay here for a little while. And so she gives birth, and then she crosses the river. That's it. She's just been traveling along with everybody else. They don't mention that she's pregnant. They just say, she says, I'm going to stop and rest for a little while. And she actually has a baby. So she's been in labor. And so these women were extremely tough.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Stoic and tough. But you're right. They just didn't even hardly mention anything about it, you know?
Yeah.
And as we talked about in one of the earlier podcasts we did, you know, Freydis is pregnant, and the Native Americans attack their camp, and all the men run off and leave her behind because you can't keep up with them. So,
I know.
Anyway.
And somehow she's the bad guy in some of those stories. Yeah. Exactly. I'd forgotten she was pregnant. You're right.
Yeah. Yeah. That's why she couldn't run off. And
that's right.
She stops and she rips open her top and she beats her bare breasts with a sword and scares the Indians away.
Yeah.
Well, so we don't have hardly anything in writing about the Norse or Scandinavian charms and their herbs and that sort of thing. But there is quite a bit in Anglo-Saxon and German that was written down because they became Christianized much earlier, and yet they coexisted with many of they didn't give up a lot of their pagan or magical beliefs until much later. So there is some written down that bear quite a resemblance to what might have been in the Scandinavian if it had ever been written down. So there's one thing called the Merseburg charms. They're incantations that were written down in the early Middle Ages, 10th century, by a monk. And it was actually written in a theological manuscript that was written in the 9th century, although there remains some speculation about the dates of the charms themselves. They might have been earlier, but it's all about it. I'll read it to you. Fol and Woden, which is Odin, were riding in the woods, and the foot of Baldur's foal was sprained. So Singrut, Suna's sister, conjured it, and Freya, Vola's sister, conjured it, and Woden conjured it as well as he could. Like bone sprain, so blood sprain, so joint sprain, bone to bone, blood to blood, joints to joints, so they may be glued. So this is a poem about Odin healing a horse's lame foot. Fol, we don't quite know who Fol is, but we do know that, you know, Freya is Freya. And Vola must, if she's Vola's sister, then that must be Frey. And they're all conjuring over it or chanting over it. You know, it depends on the translation that you read. But it's very likely that this also existed in Scandinavia, but it was just never written down. And there are skull fragments that have been found in Denmark dating to the 9th century, calling on Odin, Ulf, and Hatter to help Burr against pain and dwarf stroke. So we don't know what dwarf stroke is, but it sounds an awful lot like elf shot, which is something we know of in, you know, Anglo-Saxon England, where many of the injuries and aches and pains were caused by elven arrows in your joint somewhere. So there was a lot of protection against elf shot mentioned in Anglo-Saxon. So the Anglo-Saxon, as we kind of mentioned before, you know, they at one time had the same religion and the same beliefs as the Scandinavians. By the time they moved on to England, and by the Viking Age, they were Christianized, but they still had many of their pagan beliefs, and some of them got written down.
It's interesting that Odin is mentioned because he was mentioned in the Volsung saga too. They prayed to Odin and Freya.
Yeah.
Because, you know, we've discussed before, Odin is the only of the male gods to practice Seidr. He's criticized by Loki for doing so.
Mhm.
We talked about the little figurine where it looks like it's Odin, but he's wearing a dress. So that these people are calling on him for a child, for healing. He's just such a enigmatic God. He is just all over the place doing a lot of different things.
And he was the one who got the runes. Now,
Right, that's true too.
And so they talk a lot about runes being used in healing, and Galdr, which some say is actually chanting the runes, but no one knows for sure what that is. There's also an amulet from 11th century Sweden that commands a giant to flee and a wolf to have 3 pangs and 9 needs. It calls itself a healing charm. I mean, in other words, it says this is a healing charm, but it's written in runes. The amulet is made of copper, and it's about 3.5 inches long and 1.25 inches wide. And it calls on Thor, but they call him the Lord of the Jotnor, which is kind of weird because the Jotuns were Thor's mortal enemies. So that's a little confusing to me, unless somewhere along the line Thor conquers the Jotuns and we don't know about it. But anyway, this is from 11th century, so it's a little bit later.
Maybe the translation was off.
Yes.
Maybe it was like the conqueror of the Jotun, or, you know,
Right.
like that kind of connotation of
That
what
makes
Lord
more
would
sense
be. That
to
makes more
me.
sense too. Yeah.
But it's very interesting that they're telling a Jotun or a giant to flee, and a wolf. And so these are, and it calls itself a healing charm. So these are causes of the ailment, the wolf and the Jotun, apparently.
And then there was another amulet found in Sweden, in Kvineby, and this one is also made of copper, and it's about 2 inches on each side. So it's kind of like a little square, and it has a small hole at one end, presumably to hold a cord, so someone could wear it around their neck. And this one was carved in an interesting way. And I forget, I wish I'd written it down. I forget there's a term for how. So one line is written right side up as we would normally read. The next line is written or carved upside down and backwards.
That's amazing.
And then and it alternates that way for all the lines. And we don't know why. They don't know. Scholars don't know why they did that. But there's got to be a reason, because it was very, because they did it one after another. So.
I've actually read in somewhere about the runes that there's certain things that tell you to read them differently than they're written, so in a different order. And there's, especially like if there's 2 dots in a runic incantation, that means something. It means it's like a code.
Okay.
So maybe this is like that too.
Yeah, it might be. Yeah, or maybe they have to. Something about maybe turning the charm back and forth. Could that maybe do some kind of magic? I don't know. So it's just kind of cool. Like, oh wow, I'm gonna start doing that. Just writing things upside down and backwards. Didn't Da Vinci do that? Like mirror writing,
yes,
so people kind of use this code. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a recent translation by Jonna Louis Jensen, the first line that the carver said, they said it was under the god of soot.
Oh.
So soot or ashes were commonly used in the Middle Ages for medicinal purposes.
Oh, I did not know that.
People would use them like in combination with herbs or plants. They would ground the herb or the plant or whatever they were using, and they would often mix it with ash, and then they would kind of soak it with something, oil or butter or wine or whatever. And then it was used as a poultice or something like that. So I thought it was interesting that he was talking about under the god of soot, but I don't know who that god might be.
I know.
And this one also mentions Thor. He's using this to keep evil from himself. And he says, may Thor guard him with the hammer with which he strikes Amr. And Amr must be like whatever it is. Yeah, the Jotun who's
afflicting Buffy.
He's afflicting Buffy with a festering sore. So he's calling on Thor as well to make this thing go away.
That is interesting.
And Thor is also mentioned in regards to fertility. So in the Thrymskvita, the story where Thor loses his hammer and he dresses up like Freya to pretend to marry the Jotun who stole his hammer. So, of course, Loki is the one who convinces him to dress up like Freya and go pretend to marry this Jotun. But at the end, as part of the wedding ceremony, Thrym, the Jotun, he places Thor's hammer across Freya's, in quotes, lap as a symbol of fertility. So Thor has a lot of roles too. You know, he's this symbol of fertility. They're calling on him to help him with these afflictions. The Norse people clearly loved Thor.
Yes.
As everybody's named after him. There's a lot of place names named after him. There are Thor hammer amulets all over Scandinavia, more than any other god or goddess. So he must have really been like the god of the people.
Yes, that was the impression that I've always gotten. And also, he was not as ambiguous as some of the other, he was very straightforward. He was a manly man. There was no, the story about Freya's the only cross-dressing one, and that's a joke,
Right.
Clearly didn't want to do that. He doesn't dabble in magic.
Right.
He just goes around whacking things with his hammer.
Right.
So,
he likes to eat and drink.
Yeah.
He drinks so much they have to go get a bigger cauldron. So.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think he's and he doesn't trick people. He's the one who gets tricked, actually.
Right.
Most of the time. So I think that maybe people related to him more than they did the other gods.
He's the everyman.
Yes.
So you have something about the Christian era runic healing.
Yes, the runic healing continued throughout Scandinavia, really up into the 19th century in some of the more isolated areas. But in Ribe, which is Denmark, and in the 14th century, which, is the Middle Ages, a rune of poetry was found with a staff. And a translation reads, "I pray earth to guard and high heaven, the Son and Saint Mary and Lord God himself, that he grant me medicinal hands and healing tongue to heal the shivering disease when a cure is needed. From back and from breast, from body and from limb, from eyes and from ears, from wherever evil can enter. A stone is called svarter, or black. It stands out in the sea. There lie upon it 9 needs, who shall neither sleep sweetly nor wake warmly until you pray this cure, for which I have proclaimed in runic words. Amen, and so be it." So this is a Christianized version of what was probably a very old, Saint Mary was probably Freya or Frigg, and Lord God was probably Odin. Mm-hmm. And so this was probably carried over into the Christian era. And 9 needs, that's mentioned a lot. I don't know what the 9 needs are, but it's that magic number 9 again. There's many other healing runes that call on the Christian God, and they're found during the same period in Bergen, Norway, and in Uppland, Norway. Sometimes they're in Latin. I mean, the words are Latin, but they're carved in runic letters. So there's definitely a belief that the runes were magical in and of themselves. They were used for casual everyday things like, this bucket belongs to Sigrid, but they were also believed, as we've shown with carving them and clasping them on the joints, they were definitely considered magic in and of themselves.
Mm-hmm. I like that the grant me medicinal hands and healing tongue, because the healing tongue implies that they're going to be, a galder. They're going to be chanting or singing something.
Yes.
To heal the shivering disease. I wonder if it's some kind of a
plague.
Feverish. Yeah, a plague with a fever where they're shivering.
Well, and that was during the time, it was actually, 1350 that the plague hit Norway, and it decimated, I think it killed off like 30% of the population, and it actually sent Norway into the Dark Ages.
Oh, I can imagine.
It was a power until then. So
yeah. So the people in the Middle Ages and the Viking Age also used a lot of healing herbs and plants. So Johanna and I are not physicians, and we are not sharing this as medical advice. This is just information. Don't do this stuff unless you know what you're doing or you have a doctor's permission or something, and some of the stuff is just, yes, this is just historical information. I just want to get that disclaimer out of the way.
Yeah.
So they sometimes use spider webs to help clot blood clotting and to stop bleeding. They would use it like gauze. So you could gather up some spider webs and like put it on an open wound and it would help heal it. And I guess there's also some kind of like inflammatory components to a spider web too. I mean, I guess you wouldn't want to grab like the dirtiest spider web you've got.
No, but
it would be good in a pinch.
Yes,
I used it.
They are sticky,
Yeah, I even used it in one of my stories. They also used honey for dressing wounds and for burns. It actually has some antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties.
It does.
So I also found a document. This is from the Anglo-Saxons again, but a lot of what they had access to was the same things as the Vikings would have had access to. They would have, trading even if they weren't not native to their countries. But also a lot of these plants, in addition to being healing, they're also poisonous, or their seeds are poisonous. And so, they would have had to really know what they were doing, or they could kill somebody. And also a lot of these healing plants are bitter. One of the things they used is for a headache, they would use wormwood and vinegar poultice. Wormwood is a bitter herb, and it can be toxic if it's used, if too much of it is used, or if it's used for a long time. You could also take willow and oil and add ashes to make a slippery paste.
Willow bark does have salicylic acid, which is what's the main component in aspirin.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's an anti-inflammatory.
I used willow bark in one of my stories for pain. So
good.
Oh, and then after that, you add brook lime, which is a plant that lives near water, and stemless carline thistle, which is a flowering plant, and red nettle. You grind it all together and then add that to the slippery paste, and you bathe the head with that mixture. I mean, I would almost rather have a headache than have that rub all over my head.
Depends on how bad the headache is.
For an earache, they might have used the juice of henbane. And we've talked about henbane as something that sorcerers has used, and it was also poisonous if used in the wrong doses.
Yes.
They would make it lukewarm and then drip it on the ear.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. But they would take garlic and onion and goose fat, melt them together, and squeeze that mixture into the ear. Wow. Maybe the oil helped break things up. I don't know.
Maybe.
Yeah. For a toothache, they might chew on a yarrow plant. It's a plant in the daisy family.
And it's very common.
Yeah. And for heartburn, they would take corn cockle. And I had never heard of this before. Apparently it's an herb, but the seeds can be poisonous. They would take this, boil it in milk, and then give it to the person to drink for 6 days. I mean, maybe the milk helped more than anything.
Yeah.
For nausea, one of the things they would use was a broth of mint or carrots or ginger. And we still use mint and ginger today.
And they do work. They do work for nausea.
They do. Oh, and, in regards to the ash and stuff, because I know like activated charcoal works well for nausea. And I actually take that. So like some of these things we still do, like, take some, have some ginger tea or something for
They've been
nausea.
around for over 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm. And then they had lots of different salves for lots of different injuries. So like a internal wound, they would mix wine, oil, comfrey, and honey.
Ooh.
For a small wound, they would grind to a powder watercress, and they would boil it in butter, and then they would smear it on the wound.
That doesn't sound so bad.
No. And then they had a lot of different salves for injuries based on what caused the injury. For example, if it was caused by iron, like a sword or something, the wound needed to be it needed to be treated by a different salve than if the wound had been caused by wood or stone.
Oh,
yeah. I mean, there's just lists of things like if caused by iron, do this. And so, so a limb that's been cut off, like a finger or a hand or a foot, if the marrow has come out, then they would take cooked sheep's marrow and apply it to the injury, bind it up tightly overnight.
Wow.
I don't know if that helped to cauterize the wound or just to like keep from an infection.
Yeah.
Or to help the healing process, because it's not like they're putting the limb back on.
Right.
So
exactly. But it certainly seems like it would protect it. And also, if you put something on a wound like that keeps it from being too dry.
Yeah.
It's a barrier, but it also keeps it's a moisturizer.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember, we used to, at least I remember when I was a kid, we used to keep things drier. But now, like, I had some, like a little thing done on my face and the dermatologist said, put some like petroleum jelly on it and keep it moist, which is what we do now. But I remember for a while we didn't do that.
Yeah.
Anyway. So, and then they had some really complicated salves for cancer.
Oh,
yeah. I didn't write any of them down because they were really complicated. But this actually shows that they were aware of cancer and had treatments for it. A lot of treatments for different cancers with a lot of different ingredients. And this was for lice, which I'm sure was a problem all the time. Well, one of them was to grind oak bark and a little wormwood oil in ale. And then you'd give it to the person to drink.
Oh,
that sounds disgusting.
Yeah, kind of makes your skin toxic.
Maybe. And then they had a lot of different salves for burns.
Oh, yeah.
Too. And most of them involve boiling something in butter and putting it on it. So I guess that's where putting butter on a wound, a burn, comes from. It goes all the way back to the Middle Ages. And then they had specific cures for specific fevers. Which is, I mean, as I was reading through this, it was a really long document, but it just reinforced like how much they actually knew and tried. Like they knew this fever from that fever, or this wound needed to be treated differently than this wound, that it wasn't just do one thing and help the person. They had these really complicated things for cancer. So it's just really fascinating that they had a better understanding, I think, of the body and what to do for somebody than we give them credit for.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and I know in the Icelandic Galdra book, which has a lot of spells in it, they talk about leeks a lot. And they also talk about an herb called Frigg's herb and another one called Balder's brow. And we don't know what those are. We just know that they're mentioned in this. It's a medieval Icelandic book of spells, the Galdra book.
Neat.
Yeah.
Well, we had more than I thought we were going to have on this topic.
We really did. It was hard to find stuff, but once we got going, we really found actually quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we did that because I feel like these women aren't given enough credit for what they did. I mean, giving birth to these children and then healing people. I mean, they kept everybody alive.
Yeah. And there had to be an awful lot of research and trial and error, and then also passing this lore down. So we talk about the vulvas as having a retinue, usually women, sometimes men too, but especially women. And that's how they passed this lore along, because it was all verbal. It wasn't written down in Scandinavia until the Middle Ages, right? Whereas the Anglo-Saxon did write it down earlier, in different forms sometimes. Yeah,
or the women who the helper women, they might have been for the births. They might have been young women who were learning how to do that. Yes. So that and I wonder if I often imagine that women, a lot of them just took part in that and just kind of knew a lot of stuff. Just by being there. It was a communal effort.
It was.
So in the next episode, we'll be discussing the winter celebration of Yule.
Yes, and there are an awful lot of traditions that we observe today that came from Viking times or earlier. Yes. We have a lot in common with our ancestors.
Yes. That will be for our December episode, and that'll be fun to talk about how our Viking ancestors just celebrated their winter holidays.
Yes,
All
and
right.
how many of ours are from them.
Yes. Okay. It was nice talking to you.
Yeah, see you next time.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. You can find Johanna at johannawittenberg.com, where you'll find a free short story, a prequel to her Norse Queen series. And you can find me, K.S., at ksbarton.com, where you can also find a free short story from me, a prequel to my Norse family series. See you next time.